Hey, y'all, and welcome back to another episode of Church History That Liberates. I am Megan Rohrer, and I have with me.
Susan Strouse.
Hey, Susan, it's good to see you
Hi,
again.
Megan. It's good to see you too. How are you?
I can't complain. I can't complain.
Sure, you can, but good for you
Well,
for not.
I thought today we would keep talking. We've talked about eunuchs a couple of times. We talked about the Council of Nicaea. We talked about the Book of Daniel, and I thought we would talk about like what happened in those thoughts in Christian history about eunuchs. So, as a refresher for some folk who might not have the Gospel of Matthew memorized, in the 19th chapter of Matthew, Jesus says, "There are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone who can accept this." And so, eunuchs who were made that way from birth are people whose bodies are diverse. Cool that Jesus knew about that. Those who have been made that way by others typically were slaves who were had their bodies changed without their consent after war. And those who made themselves eunuch are people who had agency and choice in the matter. And it says that they do this for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can. And so there was a tradition in kind of Jewish faith that said you could make a special vow to God that was unique to you and wasn't necessarily the same vow that other people followed. It was called the Nazarite vow. And you would just tell the community that you had this vow and that it was for the purpose of connecting you with God. If for some reason it no longer is bringing you closer to God, you change your vow and you publicly declare that to the community. And so, this idea that you could be different than other people for the sake of the kingdom of heaven most likely is thinking about something like that, but it's hard to know because there's no follow-up text where Jesus says, and here's what it means to be a eunuch for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. I suppose you could read all the parables and figure it out, what it means, but we don't really know. What we do know is that in ancient art, we saw some of these mosaics before. These are from Ravenna, Italy. That there was a time kind of in that what's called the patristic era, which is the first 500 years. These are from the 6th century, so the 500-ish years, in the cathedrals that supported kind of emperors. And on the left, you have Daniel, who worked in under the head eunuch of the court. And on the right, you have a mosaic of Jesus, which is styled in pretty much the same way, kind of this beardless, what they called like the androgen ideal, this middle space, non-binary ideal. So this is just catching people up on what we've talked about. The thing that I wanted to let you know is that there is a lot more of these kinds of paintings of Jesus in this middle space. And so these are from a gospel paintings. Remember when they had big books that they handmade of scripture texts? They painted their own illustrations. These are from Armenia. And these are Jesus's baptism. Back in the day, you were baptized naked, which is why the angels have to hold Jesus's clothes in this picture. But there are several paintings of Jesus either tucking away their genitals or not having them at all. It's unclear which of the two it is, but it's sort of this androgynous ideal that we were thinking about. It is also possible that these were books kids looked at from time to time and someone didn't want to paint those bits. But for this, just for today, we're going to talk about what happened with those who kind of believed in this gender neutral middle space. So here's a couple more paintings also from Armenia. Tucked Jesus being baptized in the river. The next picture I kind of think is fun is Jesus on the left from a painting from a Bible in France. Jesus not only doesn't have male parts, but the water is shaped like female parts. Are you seeing the little shape in there?
Yeah.
So kind of thinking about that being an in-between space. The
Mhm.
mosaic on the right, Jesus does have male genitalia, but no beard, and sort of looks to be like a eunuch who wouldn't have been able to grow a beard. Uh,
Yeah.
and so we have these images of the middle space and people
Yeah.
being in the middle space. We talked a little bit about how the Council of Nicaea made it so that people who embodied these middle spaces got kicked out of church leadership. They were writers, prolific parts of the Christian community, and they sort of get kicked out when the men got together with the emperor at the time to create the rules of who's in and who's out. And so that changes this idea of who can be a eunuch. We know that eunuchs and people who, through self harm or self injury, modified their fertility status, or people who dressed in the opposite sex. I'm using the term eunuch to mean either of those two things, either that people
Okay.
changed their fertility ability or that they dressed in the opposite sex. We know that there were many people like that and that it was a growing number. We know Origen, one of the leaders of saying what the church was up to, was someone who had injured themselves on purpose and was thought to be a spiritual eunuch, um, following this Matthew 19 idea. Origen, we think, did this to Origen's self around 207. Council of Nicaea happens around 324, 325 ish, right? That's when they make the rule saying you can't do that anymore. Tertullian, also a kind of a fancy guy who comes after Origen, he
Mhm.
believes that self-made eunuchs, people who injure themselves on purpose, represent something sinister. So it starts to change from just don't do that, it's not required, to if you do that, something's wrong with you and you're up to like you're bad, right? And
He
so
didn't like women either.
right, he was against some stuff, right? And so
Mhm.
he's sort of reshaping this idea of who is allowed to be in and who is allowed to be out
Mhm.
in the teaching. Then Clement comes after that and starts talking about a literal understanding of bodies of eunuchs and starts talking about spiritual ideas of abstinence and the immoral trappings of the world in general. And so there's this sort of things are now moving into about sexuality, right? So it's shifting from just being about bodies that are different to becoming about something that's bad, and then finally about something that's about sexuality. Then Basil starts to get alarmed by the number of men who are becoming self-made eunuchs. And now we're at 377, which means people didn't pay attention to they ignored the ruling from the Council of Nicaea and kept doing it with such frequency that now they're having to talk about it again. And so self castration gets condemned in the Council of Nicaea and banned amongst those entering the clergy. And because it's starting to now be seen as sinister, they started to punish laity who are sort of a part of this. And the punishment for laity is 3 years excommunication from the church if you become a self-made eunuch. So it keeps happening though. People keep doing this and keep altering their bodies and altering their appeared gender
Appearance.
to other people. So much so that 20 years later, at the Council of Gangara, Gangara, which had you heard of that before?
Nope, never.
Right.
Missed that day.
The Council of Gangara now is mad that women, people who were born female, are living as male monastics at such a frequency that they have to ban it at their council. And this meant dressing in men's clothing, shaving their heads, and living as monks together. Because there was this experience in Egypt where people would live monastic life. They're called the Desert Fathers. And many of the Desert Fathers began life as desert
Desert mothers.
females. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So this changing idea starts about just wanting to make only the people who were loyal to the Roman emperor during the Civil War, starts changing to be about, oh, you must be evil if you did that thing. Then it becomes sexual. Then only after these councils, do people start to think that the only reason they were eunuchs at all in the beginning is because of wanting to be celibate, which makes no sense based on the literature about eunuchs, because eunuchs were the ones who taught sex ed, and they didn't teach it through books. They taught it through embodied experience, if you know what I'm saying. And so eunuchs were not at all thought to be celibate people. They were just thought to be infertile people.
Infertile, yeah.
So that's sort of the early church, that first 500 years, shifting from having a great deal of gender diversity to becoming fearful and believing that sexuality is the immoral part that needs to be punished. What do you think about that shift? Like, was there ever a time in your life where anyone taught you, well, early Christianity was super into trans folk?
Yeah. Where did the history of the castrati, the music to have young boys be able to maintain that kind of voice, where did that come into it?
Well, I think that's part of Roman culture. It's a part of the educational system of Greek and Roman culture was to have varying levels of a spectrum, right? And in the Greek and Roman educational system, men would teach each other in sort of sexualized, large age disparity kinds of ways. And
Right.
when you were younger, you were more feminine. And as you got older, you kind of grew into this masculinity, or as you gained power status,
Yeah.
the more you dominated other people in a sexual realm was based on your social class ranking, not based on your internal desires or ways of being. Anyone below you in social class, you could dominate, but you couldn't let them dominate you.
Right.
Are you reading between the lines? Right. So there is sort of sexuality was about a hierarchy in the ways that they believed it was appropriate or inappropriate, kind of in that Greek and Roman way of seeing the world.
Right. This is odd, though. I mean, was that part of the church? Did that become part of the church to have castrati? I mean, so it's okay to do it in one realm, but it's not okay in another. It's the church sanctions that it's okay.
Well, that's part of what becomes the public excuse to live into these letters and writings that we have amongst people about who they're in a fight with, right?
Yeah.
But who's mad at Origen and why?
Right.
The external story is at least nowadays read back into history as, well, this one group of people who celebrates this other god used to do these things, and Jewish people and Christian people wanted to be different than the other faiths that maybe had those embodied experiences. But I think the more queer historians look back in history, they find that full gender spectrum in lots of different kinds of faith. And so to say the reason this group was mad about this particular behavior is because that group worshipped a different god might or might not have been true. There's some historical evidence that kind of says there's always been differing opinions in faith
Mhm.
since
Mhm.
forever. Even all the
Right.
way in the book of Exodus, there's the people who followed Moses and the people who followed Aaron.
Aaron, right.
And the people who followed Moses had to have very strict Leviticus rule systems. The people who followed Aaron didn't. They were a bit more poetic and a little
Yeah,
bit more on the mystical side. And so these divisions of being very rule specific or being a little more go with the flow, follow the spirit have always existed.
right.
But when people have wanted to win an argument, they have often wanted to say, but we've never done it that way
Mm, that's right.
before.
That's right. Well, it's about control too, right? I mean,
Yeah,
as soon as something gets institutionalized, then we have to say this is the way and this is not the way. And if you don't follow our way, then you can't be part of us. And even beyond that, it's that you're bad. There's something wrong
right.
with you.
Well, Paul is very body phobic in his writings,
Yeah.
and Jesus is a little bit more love your neighbor, good Samaritan focused than
Hmm.
Paul.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the divisions that people see in Christianity today is the people who want to be ever inviting more in
Yeah.
the good Samaritan type, right? The good
Yeah.
Samaritan was not amongst the group of people who were religiously allowable.
Right.
Um, the whole point is that it's a person of a race and a culture that violates most of the Jewish principles at the time is the one who
Yeah.
acted rightly, right? The people who follow Paul today
Yeah.
mistake some of the stuff Paul wanted people to do with some of the stuff with what Jesus thought was right. And so I think I'm down for people wanting to study scripture and to live their life in a faith oriented way. I think where I depart from appreciating the ways that they read scripture differently and wondering if it's abusive is when they then try to enforce their reading of scripture on other people in
Yeah. That's right.
unconsensual ways.
That's right. Yeah, and so the more we understand the history of the church and of Christianity and the Bible and where it came from and who wrote it and why and when and what was going on, the more we know that there wasn't just one way, and it wasn't this
Right.
sort of well-formed institution that just rose up out of the ground with Jesus in the tomb somehow, and there it was.
Yep.
No, that's much more fluid and lots of stuff going on and lots of thinking going on and people wondering and being able to ask questions and say, what? So, what about this? And what about that? And that was all okay. And then all of a sudden, like the church puts itself in this box, shuts the doors, and said, nope, this is it. This is it from now on. And unless you follow this, then you're a heretic, you know?
Yes. Yeah. I've always thought it was really interesting that I mean like seriously, how many times have you had to go to a debate about what kind of clothes certain type of people can wear? Or had someone in a church try to tell you as a female bodied person what kind of clothes you ought to wear, what would
Yeah,
look
yeah, yeah.
better, or what they think is distracting in clothes that
No
people wear.
open-toed shoes. And
Do you
those
have to wear a hat?
earrings are distracting. No
Right.
dangly earrings.
Right. And so there's all this conversation about what clothes should we wear? What clothes? If you don't wear this kind of clothes, you got to wear that kind of clothes. And no
Mhm.
one remembers the only reason we wear clothes at all is because of the fall.
Right.
Originally God said, nobody should wear clothes, you shouldn't have any shame. And yet, even though God said the preferred way for humans and creations to be is without clothes, the one who does the sewing is God. Right? Like they got in trouble, they did the wrong thing, they were full of shame. The whole purpose is for us to reconcile with God and to have less of that shame. But when we screw it up, did God say to Adam and Eve, "You shall burn internally forever," or whatever negative thing? No. God started sewing, right? And I think that's what I notice in scripture is that
Yeah.
even in the points where God's like, do it this way, and no one does, then God adapts. Not because it's the best way to do it, it's because we're humans, and that's what happens every time.
That creation story though is so fraught with problems that it's really hard. It's really hard to like just you tangle the stuff that's in there.
Yeah, we'll have to.
There's no original sin in there, and the original sin is not sex, but that's what we all kind of think, right?
Right.
And it was
Yeah.
all Eve's fault, of course. Um, so that's very, very, very problematic on in so many ways. But that's I like your God as the sewer. That's really good to stitch.
Yeah.
But
Hey.
I'll have to ponder that for a while. But that
Well,
story just is very problematic.
then Jesus picks disciples who sew. They're in their boats
Oh yeah,
mending the
mending their
nets,
nets, right?
right?
Yeah.
Which prepares them not only for this transgressive work they're going to do, because normally you'd have to go to shore and pay the women to sew your nets,
Mm,
but also when they encounter nets that are splitting later in the story, because they're so full of food, they can
right.
mend the nets, right? And
Hmm.
keep going with God's abundance, right? But I
Hmm.
think I've just been, well, here's a question for you. When you imagine Jesus being baptized when you were a little kid,
Hmm.
did you imagine it naked?
Nope, of course not.
Yeah.
Of course, I came from a very shaming family, so I wouldn't have even known that I wasn't thinking that. I would have had no idea what being naked would have meant. Really,
Right. And
don't go there. Oh my.
how, like, if a bird lands on me and I got clothes on, it's going to be scary. But if a
Yeah,
bird lands on me and I got no clothes on, it's a whole different kind of scary.
I still don't like it.
Right? Claws and
Oh, I
just
was thinking
saying.
something else.
Well, I was not imagining the bird would land there, Susan.
No, I was thinking of the
Sheesh.
bird poop. That's what I was thinking.
Well, there's that too.
So no, I was not there. I was somewhere else.
Would it have changed anything? What do you think when you were growing up in Sunday school? Were there like big paintings on the wall of like Noah's Ark? And I'm thinking of the moments in time people choose to have up on posters or in big
Yeah.
art.
Hmm.
Would it have what would you have thought if there was a naked Jesus being baptized picture?
All I can think, I mean, I didn't go to Sunday school a whole lot in my Lutheran church when I was a kid, but I did go with our neighbor kids to the Methodist church.
Okay.
And all I can think is that they would have had like cloths covering things up because that just would not have been acceptable at all.
Have you ever seen those like Renaissance paintings where like baby cherub angels carry
Yeah.
a cloth to like
Yep.
cover the spot
That's
of the you're not supposed to
that's
see? That's what
that's
your painting
that's
would be?
what it would have been. Although we may have gone and tried to look behind it at that point. It was kind of like, the Rolling Stones album with the zipper on the
Yeah.
front that we all kind of like were trying to like get behind what was in the zipper. It would have been like that. Like let's see what's there. But
Yeah.
no, I can't imagine. No. Mm-mm. No.
Do you want if so now you're an adult, right?
Supposedly, yeah.
Say in the middle of your sanctuary they were going to put a picture of Jesus's baptism and they wanted it to be historically accurate. And so it was going to be naked Jesus. Do you want it to have private parts or do you want it to be tucked? What would you be brave enough to have?
Anatomically correct Jesus.
It would be controversial, don't you think?
I'm sure it would be.
I can't imagine.
I'm sure it would be. What would I do as the pastor?
Yeah,
I might try
if
to
you got to pick.
encourage people to do it, but I don't know. It depends on
Baby
the
cherub angels.
congregation. I wouldn't want no, I don't know. I don't know how they would what they would do. I'm sure there would be people who did not want to deal with that.
Would you be comfortable with a naked Jesus with the linen cloths left? I mean, because he had to change into the gardener's clothes. There was a moment, right? Or what about the guy in the Gospel of Mark when they
Oh yeah, runs
they
away
take his
naked. I
clothes?
love that story. I love that
Yeah,
story. It's like it's a remnant of something, right? That what in the world is that? Why would Mark put that in there? Was it him? But
I
in
think I
any
know.
event, in yeah, who?
Oh, because in Mark's gospel, he does things 3 times. Mark
Okay,
says, "You
okay,
are beloved" 3 times, right?
okay, yeah, yeah,
Eh, and that means there's 3 times that nakedness happens in the story. We
okay.
didn't notice it because we didn't remember that Jesus was naked when he was baptized. So
Okay.
nakedness at the baptism, which is the beginning of the story,
Uh-huh.
nakedness when the guy runs away naked,
Yeah,
and his stuff is taken, and then nakedness at the tomb, the
yeah.
end of the story. So the beginning and the end of nakedness.
Interesting.
There's no gardener's clothing in the Gospel of Mark, so it just ends with the shroud, right?
Yeah, yeah.
That's my best guess.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting theory. Boy, that would make a great thesis. So the remnants of nakedness in the Gospels, but that story has always sort of made me chuckle. It's like something has remained that didn't get quote unquote covered over.
Yeah,
Was
yeah.
allowed to run free. It's like how funny is that?
Well, it makes, I mean, theology after that named Jesus as the new Adam, this idea that it's bringing
Mm.
back kind of that creation again. So you got to kind of have him running free at least once.
Would Lazarus have been naked?
Well, his shroud was still on him.
Well, yeah, but
That's
Jesus
what it
said to
says.
unwrap him, right? Unwrap him
Yeah,
and
unwrap him.
let him go free. So what
Yeah, but
Did
that's
Mary and Martha like
there's no Lazarus story in the Gospel of Mark though.
no, 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 of course not. And it's not a historical story anyway,
What?
but
What?
I know, right?
What are you talking
Let's not
about?
even go there. Let's not even go there. That's a whole nother thing. Yeah,
Well,
well,
thank you for entertaining this bit of storytelling. I just like to notice things didn't start against
yeah.
gender diversity. It developed over time. And that same process we might be noticing now of people going, "Oh, it's sinister. Oh, it's about sex. Oh, it's blah, da, 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 da."
Right, right, right,
It's been
right.
the cycle of name calling, right?
Mhm, mhm. Yeah. Fascinating. I like just the whole idea of diversity of gender and all of that, but also of just this whole history of shaming just around sex, that it's a shameful thing.
Hmm.
And to be able or even going back to like the Tertullians and people calling women what do you call them, sepulchres, rotting, whatever, nasty stuff.
Hmm.
And that's just, I'm sure people who don't even know who Tertullian was or what he said
Yeah.
have just absorbed that kind of stuff through the church. That's just so hard to root out. So this kind of
Yep.
looking at things is really, really important.
But I think it's important to say to those who have been harmed by people saying it's never been this way before, so you have to
Mm,
prove why you belong
yeah,
here,
that's right.
to have at least one story where you can say,
Yeah.
no, we've
Let's
been around much longer than this
let's
silly
take a look
idea.
at that. Yes.
Yeah. And that's what we hope to do at Church History That Liberates. Is if you got ideas of things you would like us to mention, or art you'd like us to talk about, on strangely talking about art on a podcast, but hey, there you go.
There you go.
All
Sounds good.
right. Thanks everybody.
All right. Bye. See you.